Hi, I'm Pedram Rashidi from the University of Queensland. There's a lot of talk about inclusion of Indigenous peoples in international forums and organizations. Much of this talk is problematic. Often Indigenous peoples are described as vulnerable, their knowledges are presented as non-scientific and merely cultural with potential to be integrated into the existing body of scientific knowledge. The inclusion of Indigenous peoples is largely seen as a moral duty. The problem of exclusion of Indigenous peoples are often in the literature is reduced to the problem of state-centerism or that Indigenous knowledges are not compatible with science. While these are true, but they don't provide a complete picture of what is going on. The structural barriers to inclusion of Indigenous peoples, the implications of this exclusion, and ways to mitigate the barriers to inclusion are much more complex. In this paper, I tap into these complexities at the intersection of climate change governance and heritage management. I do so in a way that will be of interest to colleagues across international studies, as well as specialists in environmental governance, Indigenous environmental studies, and science and technology studies. The cultural branch of UNESCO World Heritage, and Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, are the case studies of this research. UNESCO and IPCC are authorities on heritage and climate change governance, respectively. Both organizations are well respected by scientists and policymakers, so their assessments of how climate change is affecting heritage and how it needs to be protected are a fair reflection of the mainstream discourse. Since both UNESCO and IPCC work at the science policy interface, they can be seen as boundary organizations. They engage with multiple stakeholders who often have different or conflicting perspectives on their subject matters. Cash et al. Propose a 3-criterion framework for evaluating the work of boundary organizations. To be effective, boundary work must be salient, credible, and legitimate in the eyes of its stakeholders. In this paper, my research question is, how salient, credible, and legitimate are the boundary work of UNESCO and IPCC in the eyes of their stakeholders, in particular, Indigenous peoples? I did a content analysis to identify how Indigenous peoples participate and are represented in UNESCO and IPCC. Then, by applying those 3 criteria of salience, credibility, and legitimacy, I examined the effectiveness of the UNESCO and IPCC's boundary work for Indigenous peoples. So, in other words, I investigated the forms and qualities of heritage that are seen as salient for protection in the face of climate change, the types of experts and expertise that are assumed to bring credibility to UNESCO and IPCC, and the rationalities and processes in heritage climate change assessment that are deemed legitimate in the eyes of stakeholders. The outcome of the content analysis can be summarized in these tables. You can see more details in tables 1 and 2 in the paper. But to sum up, UNESCO and IPCC assessments are only salient to the concern of stakeholders whose values and perspectives align with European epistemological trends. Further, as the paper shows, Indigenous peoples have limited agency in the relevant UNESCO and IPCC processes. That limited agency deprives the heritage climate change nexus of credibility and legitimacy from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. Having reached that conclusion, I then continued my examination of the effectiveness of UNESCO and IPCC's boundary work. What I find are that there are epistemic and institutional barriers to Indigenous participation, First, what constitutes heritage is problematic. Heritage is a European construct that corresponds with Western elite cultural values. UNESCO has historically played a key role in this extension. Heritage protection, as we know it, doesn't often align with indigenous struggle for self-determination. Second, what defines expertise in heritage protection and climate change corresponds with set of professional training in Western institutions and socializing within long-established networks of heritage and climate change experts. So by this standard or definition, indigenous knowledge holders cannot be regarded as experts. Third, the usual suspects of scientism, state-centerism, economism, and developmentalism are among structural barriers to the meaningful indigenous inclusion. So what to do? In the last part of the paper, I consider how we could enhance indigenous participation in international organizations like UNESCO and IPCC by incorporating the principles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP as we know it. UNDRIP instructs governments and international organizations to recognize indigenous rights, to practice their cultures, traditions, knowledges within their traditional lands, of course. It has been incorporated to some extent in the work of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Some refer to IPBES as the IPCC for biodiversity. At the climate change heritage or in the climate change heritage context, IPCC is lagging behind. At the time of writing this paper, there were no institutional arrangements to incorporate UNDRIP into its assessment processes. But UNESCO has made a start, and it has done so in the face of strong resistance by some governments and UNESCO's own institutional inertia. So I conclude the paper on a hopeful, if cautious note. I hope you enjoy reading the paper, and please reach out if you have any suggestions or comments. Thank you.